Jesus was an Aramaic-speaking Jew of the Middle East, and the Assyrians are Aramaic-speaking Christians in the Middle East who have endured persecution for over 1,000 years. Join Voice of the Word Aramaic Bible teacher, artist, and author Stephen Missick as he examines the Bible through the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times in which it was first revealed. Research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots. And now, Voice of the Word.
Hello, I'm Stephen Missick, and this is the second episode of the Aramaic School of the Bible. And in this program, we're going to be discussing Aramaic as an important Jewish language. Now, the Bible teaches, basically, that Jesus spoke Aramaic. We know that because Jesus is quoted several times speaking Aramaic. The disciples have Aramaic names, most of them, and there are place names that are also Aramaic. And there's even several Aramaic prayers in the New Testament. So the New Testament's in Greek, and yet we have an abundance of Aramaic words and phrases. And so the logical explanation of this is that Aramaic was the native language of Jesus. So the problem is that there's certain people out there who claim that Jesus was Jewish, Hebrew is the Jewish language, therefore Jesus spoke Hebrew and only Hebrew. So this just isn't accurate. And I think that part of the misunderstanding that these people have is that Aramaic is an important Jewish language. As I'll show in this program, these people, they don't have a proper understanding of Aramaic, of Aramaic and Hebrew. And so these people feel compelled to attack Aramaic and disprove that Jesus spoke this language. And they look at Aramaic in a negative light, which is very odd because Aramaic is an important Jewish language, as we'll see. There's some of these people, it's like, I went to Hebrew University. So, the Bible teaches that Jesus spoke Aramaic. If you have a problem with the Scriptures, I don't know why you're appealing to Hebrew University. And I don't know what kind of reputation or that Hebrew University has. We have to look at where the evidence leads us. And I think that these people who say that Jesus spoke Hebrew and only Hebrew they're trying to create a different Jesus than the Jesus in the Bible. Jesus as how they imagine a Jewish person to be, instead of what the historical record says that a Jewish person at that historical context would have been like. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He's the King of the Jews. But Aramaic is a Jewish language, and Jesus spoke it. The first thing we need to realize is these people don't really have a proper understanding of what Hebrew is. Hebrew is an offshoot, or developed out of, an earlier language scholars call Proto-Semitic. And Hebrew is the same language that the Canaanites spoke. In fact, in the Bible, the Hebrew language is called the Lip of Canaan. And the Canaanites spoke Hebrew. And the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, based on some of the words and phrases that we know from the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, their language was virtually identical with Hebrew. But let's look at there's something else about Hebrew that's very fascinating. First off, is the Hebrew alphabet, as we know it today, is actually the square Aramaic alphabet. If you look at Ezra 4:7, it says, the letter was written in the Aramaic script and in the Aramaic language. Ezra was originally written in Hebrew, in Paleo-Hebrew letters, and in Aramaic in the square Aramaic letters. The Paleo-Hebrew alphabet was displaced by the square Aramaic alphabet, which was used in Petra, Nabatea, and Palmyra. The Samaritans never transitioned from the square Aramaic alphabet. They never transitioned to the square Aramaic alphabet and still use Paleo-Hebrew. Assyrian Christians today also use a cursive form of the square Aramaic alphabet. What I'm saying is that originally the Hebrew alphabet was the same as was known as the Phoenician alphabet. And it looks a lot more similar to Greek than it does to modern Hebrew. And part of the reason is because Greek also developed out of the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. If that's another thing you could call another word for the Phoenician alphabet, is the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. So in this scripture in Ezra was writing in the Phoenician alphabet or the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, but when he quoted from this letter, he just transitioned to the Aramaic alphabet and the Aramaic alphabet and the Aramaic language. So like Daniel, Ezra is partially written in Hebrew and partially written in Aramaic, and he's noting what he calls the Aramaic language, the Aramaic letters. Eventually what happened is the Aramaic alphabet displaced the old Phoenician alphabet, and this particular form of the Aramaic alphabet is now what we call Hebrew. If you go to Palmyra, what's left of it after ISIS blew it all up, or to Petra, you'll see the inscriptions in Nabatean Aramaic or Palmyran Aramaic, and the alphabet looks extremely similar to the Hebrew alphabet used in Israel today because it's basically the same alphabet. So what happened is the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet fell into disuse, and then it was replaced by the Aramaic alphabet. So the Bible is written in the Hebrew language, but in an Aramaic alphabet, and the Jewish people still use that Aramaic alphabet to this day. Now the Samaritans, there's like 1,000 Samaritans or so, a little bit less left, and they never made the transition to the Aramaic alphabet, so they still use the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. So you go online, you can Google Paleo-Hebrew alphabet or Phoenician alphabet or Samaritan alphabet, and you'll see the difference between ancient Hebrew and the square Aramaic alphabet, which is called the Hebrew alphabet today. It's the same alphabet that the Assyrian Christians use, but the Assyrian Christian alphabet is Aleph, Bet, Tav, Aleph, Bet, Gamel, Dalet, etc. But it's now cursive. But the letters have the same name and similar shapes, but it's a little bit different. Parts of the Tanakh are written in Aramaic in the original text. So the Hebrew Bible isn't really the Hebrew Bible, it's the Hebrew and Aramaic Bible, but only a small portion of the Old Testament is written in Aramaic. Daniel, Ezra, and scattered verses and phrases here and there. So you're probably looking at, I don't know, a little bit less than 5% of the Old Testament is written in Aramaic. But substantial parts of Ezra, substantial parts of Daniel are written in Aramaic. Now, I'm going to list the Aramaic parts of the Old Testament, the Tanakh as the Jews call it. Genesis 31:47, it's a translation of Hebrew place name. Jagar Shadutha is the Aramaic form of Galid, which means heap of witness. So what happens is Jacob makes a covenant with his uncle Laban, and they built a monument. They call it the heap of witness. The Lord may watch between you and me when we're separate from each other. And Jacob, as a Canaanite speaker, calls the monument Galid, and Laban, as an Aramaic speaker, calls it the Aramaic phrase Jagar Shadutha. So that's in the Torah. You have an Aramaic phrase. This is Jeremiah 10:11. It's a single sentence in Aramaic denouncing idolatry. It occurs in the middle of the Hebrew text. So Jeremiah has like one complete verse in Aramaic, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Daniel chapter 2:4, all the way to Daniel 7:28. So in the beginning of chapter 2 to the end of chapter 7, Daniel is written in Aramaic. 5 stories about Daniel and his companions, and an apocalyptic vision. So a lot of the famous stories from the book of Daniel are written in Aramaic, like the writing on the wall, which was in itself an Aramaic expression. There's a vision of a hand that appeared, wrote on the wall, many, many tekel upharsin, which means, translated from the Aramaic, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. So it's very interesting that God himself in the Old Testament inscribes with his finger an Aramaic expression, prophesying doom upon the Babylonian Empire. Ezra chapter 4, 8 through 6, 18, and 7, 12 through 26. These are quotations of documents from the 5th century BC on the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem. So what's going on in the book of Ezra is Ezra's quoting official documents. And at this time, the Persian Empire used Aramaic as the lingua franca, the universal language. All official business was conducted in Aramaic. So Ezra is quoting from official documents, so he goes back and forth from Hebrew. And when he's quoting from official archives, he goes into Aramaic, which shows after the Babylonian Empire, the Jewish people became more bilingual. An interesting story in the book of Kings, you have the Assyrian king is taunting King Hezekiah. Well, he's got an envoy taunting King Hezekiah, and his ambassadors as Hezekiah's negotiators, standing on the wall negotiating with the Assyrian envoy. And the Assyrian envoy is like, "Oh, we're going to destroy your city. Either surrender, or you're all going to die." And the Jewish ambassador, "Oh, no, don't speak to us in Hebrew. Speak to us in Aramaic, because we know Aramaic because of the people on the wall." What's happening in that story, this is very fascinating, is that this Assyrian ambassador is speaking in Hebrew, and the Jewish envoys don't want him to speak in Hebrew. They want him to speak in the language of diplomacy, Aramaic, because they don't want the people to hear all these terrible threats that the Assyrian envoy is making. But he says, "Well, I'm going to speak in Hebrew to the people. You people standing by, if you don't surrender, you're going to die." He says that to them in Hebrew so they can understand it. But later on, the situation changed. We see the transition in the book of Ezra, where Ezra is going back and forth from Hebrew to Aramaic. But in the book of Daniel, Daniel starts off in Hebrew, and a large portion of the book, the popular stories, are all written in Aramaic. So during the Babylonian captivity, after the Babylonians defeated the Jewish people and took them to captivity in Babylon, during that time, Aramaic rose to dominance as a Jewish language. And we see that Aramaic is used in the Old Testament itself. So this is a biblical language. It's many stories in the Old Testament and the Jewish Tanakh are written in Aramaic. Something else that's important is that important pseudepigraphal books are written in Aramaic, or apocryphal books. They found many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Aramaic. There's the Genesis Apocryphon and other works of literature, but probably the most important books discovered in Aramaic are the book of Enoch and the book of Tobit. So I think that's very significant. The book of Enoch tells the story of the antediluvian age, the period before the story of Noah's Ark, when the world falls into the sins. There's a part of the story is called the Book of Giants. The Russell Crowe movie about Noah was heavily influenced by the Book of Enoch. It's a very interesting read, and in the Ethiopian version, we have many messianic prophecies that are also interesting. The Book of Tobit is part of the Catholic Bible. It tells the story of the righteous man Tobit, his son Tobias, and the archangel Raphael. It's a very good story, very interesting, but that's important Jewish literature. Next we have the Targums. The Targums are Aramaic translations of the Old Testament. Since Hebrew was largely displaced by Aramaic, Jewish people needed Aramaic translations of the Bible to understand the Scriptures. Targums were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Jesus gives a Targumic rendering of Psalm 22 from the cross. Jewish people still use these Targums. And the interesting thing about the Targums is that they are highly interpretive. What I mean by that is that it's not just a straightforward word-for-word translation. A lot of Jewish traditions were incorporated into the text of the Targums, and Jewish people still use the Targums to this day. In a sense, it's part of the Jewish Bible. So the Targums are important. There are some Targums that go back and were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but many Targums are from the centuries after the time of Jesus. Even though they may represent oral traditions that go back to the time of Jesus, there's a man named Bruce Chilton. He wrote a book called Rabbi Jesus, and one of his earlier books was a Galilean rabbi and his Bible, where, I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but he believed that the form of the Bible that Jewish people at the time of Jesus were familiar with and as an oral culture and society, was the Aramaic version, the Targums, which are altogether different version of the Bible, which is very interpretive, and it's got a lot of added details. So Bruce Chilton is looking at these Targums and supposing that the readings of the Targums do go back to the time of Jesus. And he was saying, well, Jesus was illiterate, and that Jesus was familiar with the Aramaic Targums. That was the Bible he knew. And to understand Jesus better, we can understand the Targums. I don't believe that Jesus was illiterate, though, but I believe that most people in the Holy Land at the time of Jesus, most Jewish people, could not read or write. You're looking at probably 60 to 80% illiteracy rate. The Jewish people might have had a higher level of literacy than most people in those ancient times, but most people couldn't read or write. Only the privileged few could. Sometimes people appeal to like the writings of Josephus, and Josephus is describing how the Jewish people at his time, everybody knows all the stories of the Bible, but Josephus doesn't say that everybody could read and write. So it's very unlikely, because now we're a wealthy society and we can afford to educate our children, have universal literacy almost. But at that time, you have people in dire poverty and subsistence farmer, and it just wasn't possible for everybody to be able to read and write. So I think that Bruce Chilton probably has some insights, but I don't agree with everything that he wrote. The next is the Talmud. The Talmud is a running commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is in Hebrew, and the Jews believe that the Mishnah is the oral law given to Moses by God on Mount Sinai. So Moses wrote down the Torah, but then he passed down stuff by word of mouth. That's what they believe. And around 200 AD, Rabbi Judah the Prince wrote down the Mishnah, and then the rabbis, they write commentary called the Gemara on the Mishnah, and all that commentary is written in Aramaic. So the bulk of the Talmud is written in Aramaic. Both the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian or Jewish Talmud are written in Aramaic. The Jerusalem Talmud was originally called the Palestinian Talmud, but now the word Palestinian has taken on a new meaning, so now they call it the Jerusalem Talmud, although it didn't originate in Jerusalem, it originated in Galilee. So that's kind of interesting. And there is a scholar named Giza Verms, I think. He uses the Talmud to the Mishnah to understand Jesus and his times, but some scholars look and say, well, the Mishnah is written 200 years after, 150 years or so after the time of Jesus. How can we know that these traditions in the Mishnah go all the way back to the time of Jesus? We can't for sure. So he's a good scholar. There might be some validity to the Mishnah, but I think we need to realize that it was written over 100 years after the time of Jesus. So we got to be careful with giving it a great amount of authority. And then plus, the Talmud is interesting, but as a Christian, I'm not going to recognize the authority of the Talmud. There's a lot of false teachings in the Talmud. There's good stuff in the Talmud, and there's some bad stuff in the Talmud. So just because the Talmud says something doesn't mean it's right or true. So I'm not against doing research in the Talmud and like Giza Verms did and trying to understand Jesus through the Talmud, but you have to be careful because we don't have to accept the authority of the Talmud. And there's some things the Talmud I find it really hard to believe. It's like, so you can smell the perfumes from the temple, 20, 30 miles away. It's like, really? That sounds more like a legend to me. And then it's like, well, the temple was as thick as a man, the curtain of the temple is as thick as a man's hand. And it's like, as thick as a man's hand? What do you mean, this way or this way? So you're saying it's about, several inches thick. It'd be like a wall. I don't believe that it was a veil. It was a curtain. It wasn't a wall. How would you make a curtain that thick anyway? So you just got to be suspicious about the Talmud. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying that you just got to reserve judgment when you're doing research into the Talmud. Now we're going to look at some more Aramaic sources in the Jewish tradition. Another one would be the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is the name of a book called the Zohar. This is Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalah is the mystical interpretation of the Torah, basically, of Judaism. The Kabbalah usually refers to the Zohar, which, like the Talmud, is a commentary on the Torah. The Zohar is written in Aramaic, and I think it dates to around 1500. There's a rabbi that claimed he found some ancient scrolls, and he wrote this out as the Zohar. It is in Aramaic. And after he died, his wife said that, no, he wrote it himself. He didn't find ancient scrolls. But what would she know? She probably couldn't read or write, so how can she discern all of that? Who knows? If she didn't find some ancient documents, it's very possible that the Kabbalah represents old traditions that were passed down that he wrote. So the Kabbalah is interesting, but like the Talmud, I read some books on the Kabbalah. I found it very fascinating, but it's mystical interpretation, and I think some of the ideas of the Kabbalah you need to take with a grain of salt. It's always good to exercise to theorize about things, but you can't give the Kabbalah the authority that the church has traditionally placed in the Bible. It's not something that cannot have canonical status. It's just mystical contemplations, basically. Several ancient Jewish prayers are in Aramaic, and I think that a lot of traditional prayers are in Aramaic, and probably what happened is when the Jewish people left after the destruction of the temple, a lot of them were forced to go into Europe. And I think that most Jews at that time probably spoke Aramaic. So Aramaic was like originally the Jewish language, but Aramaic in Europe, who knows how long it was spoken? It must have been. Otherwise, why would these prayers be written in Aramaic? It was displaced eventually by Ladino, a Romance language in Spain and Portugal, and by Yiddish in the Germanic countries and in Russia. But originally, these Jewish people spoke Aramaic, and so many traditional Jewish prayers are in Aramaic, such as the Kaddish. The Kaddish was probably originally a benediction after the synagogue service, and it's very interesting because the Kaddish, which probably dates to the time of Jesus, or Yeshua, the Messiah, it has a lot of similarities with the Lord's Prayer. In translation, it says, "May His great name be exalted, and sanctified be God's great name. Yit Gadal, V'yit Kadash, Shema Rabbah. And the world which He created according to His will may establish His kingdom, and may His salvation blossom, and His anointed be near in your lifetime and in your days, and during the lifetime of all the house of Israel, speedily and very soon. Amen." So you have sanctifying the great name of God, praying for the kingdom to come, and His will be done. So there's a lot of parallels with the Lord's Prayer. So another thing, like the Lord's Prayer, this ancient Jewish prayer is also written in Aramaic. I believe the Lord's Prayer was originally written in Aramaic too. Now the use of the Kaddish has changed. Many scholars believe that the Kaddish was originally used as a benediction prayer for the close of the synagogue services, but now the Jewish people have a tradition of saying the Kaddish as a mourning process when your mother, father, or child dies. So you say Kaddish in remembrance of the dead. And probably the idea is that even in your deepest, darkest hour, the time of mourning, you give praise to God for everything. Another Aramaic prayer is Kol Nidre. This is the main Yom Kippur prayer of repentance and breaking of the vows from the previous year. And this also points to the fact that Aramaic was a Jewish language. It was the Jewish language because for Jewish people, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, that's the day in which you get right with God. So for the common people, a prayer they prayed to get right with God was very important, and they had to understand this prayer. So the prayer is in Aramaic, the language of the people. It's about breaking all the vows off from the previous year to start a new year. Several Passover prayers and songs such as Chad Gadyo, that means one goat, are in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. So if you go to a Passover Seder in the Jewish community, several of the traditional Passover songs and prayers and poems are in Aramaic, which is significant. Another Aramaic prayer, which I think is very interesting, is one called the Akdamut. Now, the Akdamut was written in the 1000s, Middle Ages, in Aramaic by a rabbi, and basically it says, it was changed into a Christian hymn called The Love of God. Could we with ink the ocean fill, and were the skies of parchment made, were every stalk on earth a quill, and every man a scribe by trade, to write the love of God above would drain the ocean dry, nor could the scroll contain the whole, though stretched from sky to sky. So this is a very influential Aramaic prayer of the Jews that made its way into Christian hymn books. So you also have Ya Rebo Olam, a popular song written in Aramaic, universally sung on Sabbath evening, describes the wonder of God's creation and concludes with hope for the redemption of Israel. So you have this prayer in Aramaic that Jews around the world pray at the close of Sabbath. And certain people, it's like, no, we don't recognize the validity of Aramaic as a Jewish language. This shows that you don't understand Judaism. Anyone who claims to be a Jewish roots teacher and hostility, somebody who has hostility and claims to be a Jewish roots teacher doesn't have a very limited understanding of Judaism. When I do the fuller episodes, there's some things I'd like to share in that, which I'll introduce now. One of the Bible scholars I read, he wrote a book called The Books and the Parchments. It's F.F. Bruce. And in that book, he has a chapter on Aramaic. And he has Jeremiah 10:11 in columns. The first column is in Aramaic, the second column is in Hebrew, and the third column is the English translation. And if you look at that, you can see the similarities between Aramaic and Hebrew, such as, for instance, kidna, which is ko in Hebrew, means thus. Timorin, or temuru, which means you shall say, lahom, or lahem, to them. Eleah, in Hebrew is ha-Elohim, which is the gods. So we see the similarity. We see that Hebrew and Aramaic are indeed related. So that's a very interesting chart there. One of the rabbis said, he says, "Let not Aramaic be lightly esteemed by thee, seeing that the Holy One, blessed be he, hath given it honor in the law, the prophets, and the writings." That's the Palestinian or the Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Sota 7:2. Now, that's significant because a rabbi in the Talmud is saying that what they're arguing about, what languages they should use in the Talmud. Let's just speak Hebrew. No, let's use Greek. Should we use Aramaic? I prefer Greek to Aramaic. No, Aramaic. That's what the Talmud is, running arguments and controversies about various points of Jewish law. So this rabbi says, well, somebody's like disparaging Aramaic. He says, don't disparage Aramaic because God put Aramaic in the Torah. God put Aramaic in the law, the prophets, and the writings. All three divisions of the Jewish Old Testament have Aramaic in them. So this rabbi is saying that Aramaic is given a very special status by God, and that in the three divisions they have of the Bible, the law, the prophets, and the writings, each section has a portion in Aramaic. There's also a tradition in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 38b, that Adam spoke Aramaic in the Garden of Eden. I don't think we can really know what language Adam spoke in the Garden of Eden, and all the languages we know them, according to the Bible, probably formed after the Tower of Babel incident. And we know where Hebrew came from and Aramaic came from. It came out of Proto-Semitic, which is a prehistoric extinct language that can be reconstructed by scholarly research. The Aramaic sections in the book of Ezra, you have the letter to Artaxerxes from Samaritan officials, that's chapter 4, 11 through 16. Letter from Artaxerxes to Samaritan officials, that's Ezra chapter 4, 17 through 22. Letter to Darius from the governor of the province of Syria, which is Ezra chapter 5, 7 through 17. Part of a letter, which the beginning is lost, from Darius, the governor of Syria, chapter 6 and 6 through 12. And the letter from Artaxerxes to Ezra, chapter 7, 11 through 26. So this is the official correspondence mentioned in the book of Ezra, and that's also the sections containing Aramaic in the book of Ezra. So in conclusion, we've seen through this that the Old Testament, the Tanakh, is the Jewish scriptures. And this rabbi noted that in the Tanakh, each three sections of the Old Testament, the Holy Bible, the Jewish people, has Aramaic in it. And then beyond that, we see that important documents and source materials of the Jewish people, the Talmud, the Kabbalah, and the Targums, they're written in Aramaic. And then several popular songs and prayers. In fact, prayers in time of mourning, such as like the Kaddish, and prayers at the conclusion of the Sabbath. So every week, Jews are using Aramaic. It's an important Jewish language, and people who are trying to disparage or cast off Aramaic and dismiss it as not an important language. It's used in the Old Testament, it's used in Jewish literature, but it's also used in the New Testament and the Gospels. Not just in the Gospels, Paul uses Aramaic here and there in his epistles. And also with the Syriac church tradition, you have a bulk of literature used by Christians in the language of Jesus in Aramaic. So it's an important Jewish language, it's an important Christian language. So if you're doing research into the Jewish roots of the faith or the Semitic roots, it's really essential to explore the Aramaic, as we will continue to do in the next episode. And I hope you can join us for the next episode of the Aramaic School of the Bible. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Research, rescue, and restore. Help Voice of the Word and Aramaic Christian Ministries mission research the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times of the Bible. Rescue persecuted Assyrian Christians in the Middle East and restore Christianity to its original Semitic roots. For Stephen Missick's books, online giving, and other resources from Aramaic Christian Ministries, visit www.stephenmissick.com. Join us next time on Voice of the Word as we research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the church to its Semitic roots.